Thank you, Astrid, for the introduction. And I'm speaking today from the unceded lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, where I live and work in Ottawa, Ontario. And today I am going to be talking about how we change the story that we tell about ecological gardening. I've been talking about sustainability in native plants for quite a while, and there are a few things that I've learned to approach differently than I did at the start. One of the big ones is that rather than defending the native plant and ecological gardening movement, I prefer to flip the narrative right from the start, framing native species as the default for creating gardens, and then that there needs to be a specific reason for including a species that isn't native to the region or the continent. And there can be good reasons for including non-native species. Growing local food is one that does influence plenty of my own personal choices, but we do rarely subject conventional landscape practices and garden plant selections to the same requirement for justification that their inclusion that we often do when we suggest planting native species. We have to justify, oh, well, it's a host for this or it does that. We don't go through that process with a lot of garden plants. They mostly just get by on sort of the momentum of familiarity more than anything else. So let's just flip the narrative. Of course, we're going to plant native plants unless you have a really good reason for planting something else. And there is room in most gardens for a few exotic species. They just need to be more like the special treats. It's kind of like the difference between eating a steady diet of salty fried foods and enjoying a bowl of your favorite chips now and then because they bring you joy. In moderation, they become something special rather than just lost among everything else, and then mostly just leaving us feeling punky and guilty. So mostly native plants, a few other things when we have particular reason for it. And something else to keep in mind in this is that those of us who are talking about the ecological potential for green spaces aren't the only ones influencing the narrative of what to expect around our homes and in our communities. And this is a very intentional narrative that's being put forward. The one that we're sort of pushing against. This isn't, what you see isn't the default. It's a narrative that has been developed over time. And over the last few decades, the horticultural industry has been drifting further and further toward ecologically bereft hard surfaces, minimal diversity landscapes. But like most industries, a couple of years of global pandemic has made a lot of us learn how to pivot what we do and how we do it. And something that learning to dance taught me was that to successfully pivot without falling or flailing, you do need to find your center. So what's at the center of urban and suburban gardening? I used to say that what the horticultural industry sells is pretty, but that's not quite it. What we really sell is feel good. We know that birds and invertebrate species are in catastrophic decline, mostly from land use change and agricultural practices mostly from land use change and agricultural practices that aren't in the direct hands of gardeners. But the decline itself is something that those of us who garden can do something about. Growing public awareness around how biologically limiting a lot of conventional plant choices, maintenance practices, and hard surface centered designs are, along with the ecological and carbon costs of extraction and transportation of bulk materials, those are looming challenges that the horticulture and landscape industry will be facing in the very near future. The tone that we use around agriculture, where it did not used to come under any scrutiny because they fed us, over the last couple of decades has massively shifted to being there's some really critical conversations going on. Agriculture still has the reality of they're feeding us. Horticulture, if it's put through that same in detailed sort of review of what the costs here, we don't have the excuse of we're feeding everybody when it comes to the costs of what we do. So we're going to have to really look at the story that's being told, not just those of us who are talking about ecological things, but the whole industry as a whole. And to be relevant rather than vilified in the coming years, horticulture will need to make the biggest pivot yet. An industry-wide shift away from moving materials around and towards providing guidance, local knowledge, and specialized care. And sometimes the talk of rewilding or shifting to plant-centered and ecological landscapes is interpreted as a threat to the horticulture and landscaping world. And it's a world, and I've been in it for a long career, which does have really deep roots in the colonization of land and in the displacement of native life. But the reality is that, if anything, we need more people to be doing this work, not fewer. Centering ecological health and resilience doesn't eliminate the need for hands-on expertise. Getting away from bulk transportation doesn't eliminate the need for labor. Local materials still have to be placed where they are needed within the landscape. Moving away from maintenance that fights against ecosystem progression, we actually call it maintenance for a reason as opposed to care. Moving away from that maintenance that fights against progression doesn't eliminate the need for care. There aren't a lot of large herbivores or beavers in most human-centric communities, and seasonal burns don't fit well into most suburbs. We'll still need to be the sources of the types of disturbance that most thriving, diverse ecosystems require. What's currently being spent on heavy equipment, fuel, materials, transportation, and very generic maintenance of a limited range of plant species can go a long way when directed towards living wages and locally grown plants. When caring for local spaces can provide a livelihood level of income because we're not paying for the heavy equipment, fuel, and materials, truly local expertise can become a reality. So we can move away from the generic maintenance to the more ecosystem-specific maintenance. And when the supply chain is short enough that you can actually know everybody in it, ensuring that it doesn't rely on exploitation actually becomes possible, as does reuse and cycling of materials. If it's a small geographic area, we can actually reuse materials and containers and things like that. An ecological garden isn't an idea that home gardeners need to be sold on anymore. Enough are already on board. That's actually the service provision and the plant availability that's falling behind demand. Tending nature, native plants, and every gardener's role in fostering biodiversity is an online series by Ohio State University that's going on right now, and it's had over 7,000 people registered to participate in the 6-session series. Doug Tallamy, with his message of reversing biodiversity loss by filling our landscapes with native species, was one of the most popular garden speakers last year. Talks given by Robin Wall-Kimmerer with her message of caring for the rest of nature as the rest of nature cares for us fill up, they add more spaces, and they fill up again. In an era of accelerating ecosystem breakdown, doing something to reverse that decline while also supporting local livelihoods and creating spaces to reconnect with the rest of nature is a valuable service. Pair that with supporting local economies and eliminating exploitation of workers and ecosystems, and service providers have something to offer that clients can feel really deeply good about. And we like to spend our money on the things that we feel good about. And annual spending in the ornamental horticulture and industry in Canada was over $8 billion per year, even before the pandemic renewed many people's interest in the green spaces around our homes and in our communities. That's $8 billion every year that can support local economies and local ecosystems in regenerative rather than exploitative ways. And it comes with flowers and butterflies. So we can tell a better story, and there's no shortage of people who actually want to be part of this story. And so there's a huge client base out there that just needs people to support them. We can do that. So, questions?
Sundaura, that's beautiful. I really like how you framed what is being sold is not first and foremost about being pretty, it's about feeling good. And now you framed it in a way that we can garden in a way that it's something to feel good about, to really feel good about. So, and because the narrative is spreading so far and wide, I mean, that's phenomenal that they're getting 7,000 participants at that the University of Ohio series. That's just phenomenal. It just goes to show you how we've hit the up curve on the S, which it's been a long time coming. So and it doesn't have to be a threat to conventional hort, as you pointed out. So how do you deal with those people then who are feeling threatened, whether it's clients or others in the field that you might be having to work with? I mean, a lot of jobs that I'm on, I'm working with a lot of different trades coming on board. I'm always very careful to position myself not as a threat. It's a dance, isn't it?
It is, and part of it is that there are still a lot of clients, not out of any, like, they don't want to cause any harm, but a lot of people don't actually know where to look for the potential harms, or understand what's possible. I'm working on a little video right now, which is about building gardens in making gardens in an ecologically regenerative way, the actual soil health stage, because it's an area where as soon as I talk to potential gardeners who are just getting into it, and I talk about where that bulk garden soil comes from, which is mostly excavated out of peat bogs and drawn from agriculture, where it should be going back from land, or being drawn from forestry, where again it should be going back into the ecosystem. People have no idea, and I go, oh well, it only takes a couple of years of careful tending to actually convert an awful lot of soils over to really healthy soils. I find a lot of people are actually really engaged if they can be offered some guidance on how to get there. And when it comes to a lot of trades, I must admit I've shifted my attention very much to the living part of the landscape, because there's so much potential there that I don't think necessarily the hard surfaces need much more attention. They're getting plenty of screen time and advertising time from the existing industry. So I've really shifted over to, I'll talk to the people and work with people who are actually already sort of interested and engaged and are wondering how, because I think that's where the growth is. There's so many people who want to be doing this and they're going, but how do I do it? And I'm like, okay, let's work up with those ones, and then just keep inviting everyone else in to join, because the backlash against the industry, I don't have to push that. It's going to come, because people are going to start to look at it and go, but you're exploiting systems, and you have a huge environmental impact, and you're decreasing water infiltration, and you're displacing native species. That's already building. I don't have to do anything there. I'm going to work with the ones who are like, okay, so how do we do it differently? And because making that pivot is where I think there's a huge amount of potential. And also, so many people come into this industry want to do different things that are good for the ecosystem, and then they're basically trained, and I really saw this when I was teaching, they're trained how to sort of beat the ecosystem into submission as opposed to help it thrive. And that's not why they came into the industry. And a lot of the people who really care leave, and I'm like, no, here's another version. There's work to do here. We just need to communicate about it in a different way, and not let the narrative be dominated by the companies that are selling paving stones and synthetic turf, who have been dominating more and more of the garden space and the landscape space over the last few years. Is that rambling enough for you?
No, you bring out so many really good points. I love the way you say that. Feeding the landscape into submission. That's such a good visual for me, and that's I think why people look at landscapes as such a big job. Like it's either you're you're a gardener willing to do that kind of work, which is very high maintenance, versus caring for, as you pointed out, the difference between just generic maintenance and caring for. Can you expand a little bit more on that distinction? I think it's really important.
Yeah, so generic maintenance is keeping the landscape often at a point, I would tend to say, sort of 2 or 3 years past planting stage. So if you think about sort of the perennials and the shrubs and that, what they grow up to be. And again, like, work for years as a designer, you lay things out, you do the planting spacing and that for a few years of growth, so that you have something in there. But for, you know, things aren't packed right from the start. But then the next sort of 10, 15 years of the landscape is actually about cutting back and mowing and trimming and sort of trying to keep it at just that stage. And then when it's no longer healthy at that stage, because there hasn't been sort of room for sort of the natural progression as the short-lived species die out and longer-lived species start to grow out, and as, frankly, grassy areas often progress towards more woody ones. If you don't allow for any cycle, you can have a cycle and an interruption and a cycle interruption, but you need a few years in that cycle as opposed to like weekly cutting back, because maintenance is about maintaining, keeping something in a static state, which is great if you're trying to take care of physically constructed things, our houses, our machines. Maintaining is great, but in living systems, you have to allow progression if they're going to remain healthy, but instead we try to force them into a specific static state, which takes a lot of work. And then when they're no longer can no longer maintain their health in that, then we rip them out and we start over, which is why typical sort of conventional landscape usually has a life cycle of 15 to 20 years at the most before we literally rip it all out and we bring in all new stuff. And if you look at an ecosystem, that's still the baby ecosystem at that short time period.
What you just finished saying there about it being a progression, well, that's really one of the key differences when we're looking at ecological design versus conventional landscape design, that we're really designing not to achieve a perfect state, but to create a system that can learn, grow, and adapt to changing conditions and requirements. It's actually from regenerative design, Lloyd Richard's design. What is regenerative garden design? I really like that. It just means that regenerative can never become a label, because there would never be a final state to it. So it's designed to continually shift and change with the seasons and years, and allowed to be a part in the conversation in its current form. So that's part of, I guess, the education piece when you're dealing with clients as well. Not to expect that you're going to have a final state and it's always going to stay the same.
Yeah, that's actually part of why I decided to start offering courses to teach people how to be with plants and ecosystems, because I like to say, the land hasn't forgotten how to take care of us. We forgot how to take care of the land. And so much of design actually demands change of the land and the plants, but actually asks very little change of the humans that are in that relationship. So it doesn't get to actually be a relationship. It's very one-sided. We dictate the land has to change, as opposed to going, okay, how do we be in relationship? How do I get my needs met while you get your needs met? And actually finding that space in the middle where there's a bit of change on both sides, but then you can both thrive. And a lot of what I see both in, well, most narratives to do with land and ecosystems is we either control and can decide everything about them, and this is a lot of our current agriculture and our landscaping and horticulture. We decide everything, and it has to be the way we decide it, or we are completely separate from it and it can do whatever it wants. And that's a lot of conservation, is we got to get the humans out of here because they just destroy everything. And actually, while those seem like very different things, both of them say humans don't have to change. We can either control it or not control it, but our actual state doesn't have to change. I'm going, there's actually a whole different direction to go in, where it becomes a question of how do I need to adapt, and then what can't I adapt in myself or my own lifestyle of that, and that then I do need to be creating some alterations so that this habitat, this ecosystem can support and meet my needs. But putting the question of who has to do some change, who has to change here, it's not one or the other, it's a bit of both. And that's a less simple space to navigate, but it's one where I think there's so much more potential, and it's a lot more rewarding to actually sort of help spaces be well while they're also helping you be well. It becomes a really joyful relationship, as opposed to one that's just on the spectrum of how much control do we exert over the ecosystem. All, none, a little bit in the middle, but how do we actually enter into the relationship and go the other direction on that, not just along that spectrum. How do you change story? Well, first of all, you are doing the right thing in that you're just doing it. And you actually have a legal constitutional right to do that, by the way. The chapter, or the Charter of Rights, says that's you expressing your political opinions, and we're allowed to. So you have a right to do it. The other thing that, again, and sometimes it's the flip the narrative, because you're seen as doing something different, but we don't look at what is normal very often. We don't actually go, well, wait a second, you're asking me why I'm doing this. Do you know why you're doing that? And especially when these are all these costs associated with doing that. You're hurting the environment, you're using all this fuel, you're depleting the soil, you're requiring inputs, you've eliminated any capacity for habitat. So what is the benefit from all of those costs that you're implementing? And the actual thing, and it sort of took, again, thinking about these things for a while, because again, I worked in this. I've designed those like $100,000 landscapes with far too much concrete in them. I've done that. I have awards. I have award plaques for doing that. But what they're actually doing, and what we've done as an industry, is we have shown. We show to everybody else what a good job we are doing making the landscape behave. And I've been sort of really thinking about how we change some certain language in our relationship with plants. And I don't have kids, but I've actually been following a lot of the people who are talking about how to raise children well, because it actually puts a lot of the responsibility on the adult to learn good skills, to actually provide this other living being who has agency with what they need to thrive. And it's like the language that's coming from some of the parenting, the conscious parenting and things like that, is actually some of the best examples I've come across, where it's a combination of you have responsibilities, but it's not a responsibility to control. And we actually have a really deep cultural expectation that you are responsible for controlling the land around your home. And if you fail to do that, you are not properly contributing to society. This is the narrative that is built on, that expectation is built on. And most people don't realize it. And when they do, they actually they're like, oh, that it's just momentum carrying it on, and haven't stopped and thought their way through. So that's part of that sort of flipping the narrative is, and this is something else that I as somebody who was raised vegetarian and switched to vegan a few years ago, and I eventually got tired of answering the question, why are you vegan? And I started going, well, why do you eat meat? And most people have never had to stop and answer that. I can actually come up with a better argument for why to eat meat than most people who eat meat can. I can actually lay it all out. There's some really good examples of why including meat in your diet might be a good idea. But most meat eaters can't tell you what they are. So when it comes to the ecological gardening, I'm done defending it. Of course, these species belong in this space. Why in the world would you not include them in this space? They're beautiful. They do all these wonderful things. We're completely dependent on them for our survival. Isn't it great that we can do something for them? And just go with that, because it's a narrative that I think more and more people are wanting to join in with. And just invite them in, as opposed to worrying about fighting with the people who absolutely love the leaf blower and they don't like what you're doing. Don't worry about them. Do your thing.